Hey everybody, welcome to Planet Coaster College. Today I'll be talking about the spinning coaster, which in-game is known as Spiral. Now there are many different types of spinning coasters in the world, which aside from the fact that they all spin, are very different, and if you want to make a realistic spinning coaster, these differences are something that you want to keep in mind, and that's why I'll get into a slightly longer than usual backstory here. The in-game spinning coaster is a Maurer design since they come in single cars with seats spinning outward. And these are also the most common type of spinning coaster, like some famous examples are Winges at Phantasialand or Spinball Wizard at Alton Towers. But even for this one coaster there are many different types, and there are also many different companies which make these coasters. So I want to quickly start with saying what makes this a Maurer spinning coaster, and then delve into what types of Maurer spinning coasters there are, and what way you should want to build it in Planet Coaster, and eventually, hopefully, maybe one day, we'll build one as well. So that's the plan. Basically, the way that we know that this is a Maurer spinning coaster is because there are also spinning coasters manufactured by other companies. There are Gerstlauer spinning coasters, but these have the seats face the center of rotation of the car, so you're looking at the other riders instead of your surroundings. The same goes for spinning coasters manufactured by Intern. And there are also mech spinning coasters which look a lot like the in-game spinning coaster, but they actually come in trains instead of just one car. So we definitely know it's not those. So by the looks of it, the in-game spinning coaster is a Maurer design, but it doesn't actually make it that much more simple yet. Because a spinning coaster like this one is definitely not to be confused with a Wild Mouse coaster. I've already seen many people build Wild Mouse style coasters with the spinning coaster, but of this type it's actually usually a compact coaster that spins around, but with a smooth flowing layout with large drops and banked curves, whereas traditional Wild Mouses or Wild Mice only have very small hairpin turns and simple drops. So it's a bit more of a modern take on the Wild Mouse. I think that's probably the easiest way to get to understand it. So it is a bit different, and even though you can make a traditional Wild Mouse with it, and I definitely think that's still a really cool idea, in this video I want to get into the real new sort of Wild Mouse that this is. And there are two basic types of these Maurer spinning coasters. There's the standard models and there are custom models. And of the standard models there are actually three different models. The first one is the SC2000, which is only about 11 meters tall. It's actually very similar to the traditional Wild Mouse coasters and has just a few hairpin curves and some drops. There's the SC2000 model, which is a very common standard model with all kinds of different curves. And then there's the SC2200 model, of which there's only one, which is Spinball Wizard at Alton Towers. Now these are all standard models, so if you want to recreate any of these, I'll put some links in the description to where you can find the layouts. There's actually an entire brochure of what Spinball Wizard is like. And for the models as well, Maurer has some brochures on the coasters which can be really interesting to read through if you really want to go for that pure realism, or if you're just interested in it. But basically, these things can all just be very faithfully recreated by looking at the real life versions. The most interesting type is that last type of spinning coaster, which is the SC3000. And this is the spinning coaster with custom layouts, which means that every SC3000 spinning coaster is different, but they all have some similarities based on which you can make a realistic spinning coaster, and that is what I want to try today and show you how these things more or less work. So as a quick summary, we've got all kinds of different spinning coasters from different manufacturers. The one in-game is a Maurer spinning coaster, which means that it's not a traditional Wild Mouse coaster, and instead it has some banked curves, and it's a very smooth, twisty kind of layout. And there are different types of these Maurer spinning coasters as well. There are some standard models, and then there are custom models, and the custom ones are the ones which are always different, and what I'll be focusing on in this video. So with all that out of the way, and without further ado, let's get into making one. We can find the coaster down here in the bottom of the coaster section, and the station is actually relatively small for these types of coasters. This is actually already a somewhat large station, and you don't really have to worry about raising it up too much. They are usually quite low to the ground, and from the station it is actually quite usual for these coasters to go into the lift hill straight away as well. Now before I'm going into the lift hills, I do want to get a small brake section in as well, and already get a catwalk so it does connect to the station. And then we're gonna go up with the lift hill, which kind of as per usual can just be about 30 degrees, and since we are dealing with very small cars here, it can be a very short sort of snappy transition into the lift hill here. Something like that should more or less do. Now as for the heights of these coasters, they are actually quite low usually. Somewhere between the 15 and the 25 meters is where you'd want to go realistically. Now for the top of the lift hill, we want to make sure that always we want to go down a little bit so that we're actually getting clean off the lift hill and we can't really stall there. And what I also really want to note about this is that you can actually feel free to make this a super fast lift hill. Usually these things go up super rapidly, so might as well up the speed of that a little bit. And after we get off the lift hill, sometimes they kind of curve about. They don't usually get into a straight drop, straight down. So in this case, I'm going to do something similar to that as well. What I do want to do though is turn on the banking offset, which is just going to help us make those curves a little bit more smooth as we start to bank. The car is sort of going to stay in the middle of the bank, which especially for spinning coasters where you're going to be curving quite a lot and having the car spin around as well, is something that will help out in the long run, making this thing a bit more smooth. Now what I actually want to try in here is just start off with the first section where we're not entirely going to dive into the ground yet. To be very honest, I am just winging it with this layout, so I'm really just basing it on what these things are like generally. And in this case, I think I'm gonna steal a bit from a coaster of which I don't actually remember the name anymore because they recently changed it. Something with Nara. Anyway, a small sort of pre-real part section where it just drops down a little bit and gets into a sweeping curve underneath the lift hill here. And then we're gonna do something else with this. Yeah. Let's go up a little bit and prepare for a block brake section. Now you might be surprised as to why exactly I'm heading into a block brake section now. Reason for that is that these coasters do tend to have block brakes throughout their entire layouts, quite a few, and there is an important reason for that. Basically, no coaster is allowed to be on the same block at any given time, and since these coasters run very small cars, but a lot of very small cars at the same time on the layout, you need a lot of block brakes in order to be able to run multiple trains on the track at a time. So we're definitely gonna realistically need all of these block brakes. So let me just get a quick block brake section in here. And for all of these block brakes, just for realism purposes, I like to attach a catwalk to it as well. There we go. Now this looks terrible, of course, so as for my smoothing, I usually just kind of grab the different parts at once, and after I'm done doing that, grab an entire section of track between different block brakes to make sure that it's all smoothed out. So yeah, by doing this enough, it should generally be decently smooth. It's probably not gonna end up being perfect, especially around this transition here where there isn't really too much space left. I think I wanna actually transition this out a little bit more as well. Yeah, looks like that's actually gonna be a bit of the problem. Sometimes you find these little areas where you just can barely get it smooth at all, and you just wanna hit an extra bit of smoothing. Like simple helixes like this usually work out quite alright, but it's especially the transitions between different curves which may end up being very hard to get smooth. Now after I get a general idea of what it should be like, I like to just hit smooth all button at once, and that should generally smooth it out to a pretty alright level. Now testing the ride can give us a pretty good idea of how smooth it is at the moment. So let's check that speed. Seems like a pretty nice drop down there. It's actually a little bit too fast in here. I'm gonna raise that up a bit. Alright, that seems pretty good. Now let's get into a very steep drop and really go down to the ground for the first real drop of the ride. Have to turn on the banking offset again when we're starting a new part. Now you might also notice that my banking offset is a little bit exaggerated. Mostly I do this because after smoothing it removes the banking offset, so I also want to make sure that it's a little bit more than I need, so that after smoothing we're at a more accurate level. And let's get down into sort of curved steep drop, see how that works. Now for a lot of these elements you're also going to have to remember that they might look absolutely horrible, kind of like this does, once you know you haven't smoothed it out yet, but after you're smoothing it should usually turn into something that's decent. So all that's really important here is that we get the general shape right, and the fact that it looks horrible at the moment in terms of track work is something that we don't really want to worry about quite yet. Now over here I want to build what is probably the signature element of these coasters. It's called an intern, and a lot of these spinning coasters have them, so much so that they're kind of a bit of a flagship thing for Maurer. And what they are is they're a turn that you make while you're also going over a hill, and the car banks to almost 90 degrees, which means that depending on what place in the car you're sitting, you're either looking directly at the sky or directly at the ground. Now, if it wasn't entirely clear from that kind of shaky explanation what these things look like, I'll kind of try to build one right now. You want to go up in a pretty steep fashion, something like this, maybe a little bit less steep. We don't want to hit too high G-forces at the bottom there. And once you're curving, you kind of want to make sure that the layout or like the direction of the track kind of seems into the same direction. And what I mean by that is that when you look from the side, it still looks like it's a straight line, even though we're clearly curving toward the side here. That's probably the easiest way, or like the rule of thumb, to remember how to make one of these things. So on the top over here as well, we want to bank it quite a bit, just like that, so that when we get to the top you can't really notice that it's a separate curve, just like that. That actually looks quite good. And once we're on this other side here, we want to start banking back the track. There we go, something like that. And going back to the ground again. Let's see, looks like it's a little bit too steep like that. Oh, and we are just a tiny bit too low here, so I'm gonna move down the entire element, which shouldn't be too hard. I want to finish off this side, and if we grab the entire element just like this, we should be able to lower it like that. There we go. Now let's smooth out the beginning and the last section of the element to make sure that the transitions are still correct, but it should make this with a slightly better speed than it just did. There we go. That's quite good. Looks like this could be banked a little bit more. Maybe we want to bank it a tiny bit more on the top as well, and make sure that these parts have some smoothing as well. But that looks like a pretty alright Immelman curve. Now these come in slightly different shapes and sizes as well, but the very basic premise is that you have that almost kind of half pipe-esque movement going to the top of that hill and coming down again on the other side here. And I just love the way that this element looks. Also keep in mind, and this is something that I completely forgot, so you're going to have to unlock the cars. And I just realized that's what we're going to need this space for. So we're going to unlock the car spin here. Because as you might have noticed, the cars weren't actually spinning. Reason for that was that the car spin wasn't actually unlocked yet. And as soon as you put an unlock car spin element in there, the cars are going to spin, and this is basically the look that we're going to want to have. And you see on this element as well, well in this case it doesn't actually work because they're kind of horizontal, but you'll see that the car sort of stops spinning and you kind of crest up the hill and back again, with the car kind of staying in the same position, which is kind of interesting. So here we're going to go back up again. I feel like it's time for another one of these block breaks. Trying to figure out where exactly these block breaks should be headed. I think it's good to make a curve back into the location where we just now were. So let's gonna start make a big curve into that direction, see what kind of speed we have left once we crest the top of that hill. Yeah, that looks like a pretty decent speed to do a block break. Although maybe we are kind of messing with these supports on the other side, so that's something that I do kind of want to avoid. So let's kind of do it like this. Hopefully that's not too tight. I think that's doable. Let's check the speed. And before the car is here, let's quickly smooth out that curve. Looks not too bad. Although I think we can use some more banking for it. Yeah, with some extra banking, that's going to be a pretty fine curve. Alright, so it's time for another one of these block breaks. And the rest of the layout is pretty much very similar to these parts as well. Just a lot of twisting curves and turns and some slightly banked parts. You could also add a slightly smaller immelman turn, but since this one is already quite small, I don't think there's too much of a point in that. Some small airtime hops and stuff like that can also work, so I'm just going to finish it off in a very similar way from this point onward. Looks like a small helix coming very low to the ground might be very interesting after the element which we have over here. One thing to also remember about these coasters is to try to make them as compact as possible. Kind of stay very close to the parts of the track which you've built earlier, because these are also supposed to be some slightly lower budget rides, some family rides which you can fit in a very tight footprint. So that's something that I also want to keep in mind here. But that seems like a pretty good helix. Again, it looks absolutely terrible, but after some smoothing it is kind of going into the direction that I want to, so it will be fine. Alright. Now this could actually be a bit of an airtime hop in here, I just realized. It's not too often that you see it, but I think it is actually a pretty interesting element. So since we have a straight section going on here, I think I might as well try that and see how we get out of it. Now I'm just smoothing this all out as per usual, and hopefully in the end this should be a pretty smooth element as well. You'll notice very often as well that as soon as you do this quite a lot, no matter how much you hit the smooth button, it doesn't really move as much anymore. Like you'll notice that when I select all of the track pieces and start hitting smooth at this point, it changes it a little bit, but the more you do it, the less it changes. And there's kind of this moment where when this has happened for a few track pieces for a few times already, I think that's the best moment to just grab everything at once and just smooth it all out in one go. And usually you have a very smooth track section after that. Alright, now we're almost at the height of the station and we already have 3 block break sections. So I think this is a good time to get into the last helix and do a bit of twisty track before we get back into the station. Which isn't too big of an issue at this point, since we're also going to have an extra block break section just before the station, which means 4 block break sections in the end, which is pretty good. Something like 3, 4, 5 block break sections, there we go, is something that I would definitely go for with a coaster like this. And as you can see, we are losing quite a bit of speed here, and one thing that we also want to make sure is that it doesn't really become too obvious that we're losing all of this speed. So as we're getting toward the end of the coaster here, I also want to make the helixes a little bit tighter so that they kind of feel just as fast as the faster helixes, which are a lot less tight. Although I do want to try and kind of get to the other side of the lift hill here. Let's see if we can actually still make this tiny bit wider. But yeah, I'll finish off the layout with some slightly twisty track sections and see how that works out. Now with this final helix I want to be very careful, since this is a really small helix, and smoothing it out too much will just make the helix too small and kind of get rid of the round shape to it. So be very careful with the smoothing and don't be afraid to just kind of move the track back every now and then to get a very circular shape that gets gradually smaller as the coaster gets higher into that curve, into that hill, and slows down a bit. Since, as you can see, we are really hitting some brake section speed in there. In fact, it is a little bit too slow. So realistically, I should probably lower this entire thing a little bit and give it some extra speed to work with. Now after one final round of smoothing, this part of the layout is pretty much done, and the entire layout is more or less done. It's a bit more helix heavy than I kind of would have liked. Like some S-bends in these kinds of coasters are really fun as well. So just some parts where you just kind of go back and forth between very short curves. But I think the helixes work out best in, making this thing very compact and getting as much as we can out of the coaster, since it's really slowed down until almost a complete stop at the end of the layout. So that's quite good. So here I just want to add some friction brakes to slow it down to an even more manageable speed as we get into the catwalks, and finally add some final brakes, some final block brakes to make sure that we can actually add some extra trains to this. In fact, I feel like we can, we have space to add some extra block brakes to this as well, so might as well. I'm just gonna put 2 block brakes here near the end. Maybe some extra regular brakes, and then into the block brakes we go. And you can see we do have that slight incline over here, and if everything's good, by the time that we curve around to the station, maybe we need to go down a little bit more, we should be pretty much at the exact same level as the station is. And yep, we are. So with a bit more smoothing, this curve too should be the way it is supposed to be. There we go, and we have a neat curve back into the station. In fact, the brake run is so long at this point that I feel we can actually remove a small part of this and actually make the brakes a bit longer from this section and just have a regular connection for the track here. Alright, now our coaster is looking pretty swell, but there's one more thing to note. We want to turn on the block section so that we can run multiple trains, realistically. So let's get the number of cars up to about 4 as a first test and kind of see how that goes. I would sort of love to go for 5, but the important thing here is that I want to try to make sure that the cars can continually keep riding the tracks without having to wait at the block sections. So by the time that this car gets to the next block section, it will hopefully already have passed that with the car in front of it, which means that the cars don't have to wait on any of the block sections, which is usually why I would recommend getting 1 less car than you can in total, and at least test the amount of cars before you actually go through with it. Though it looks like we might actually be able to run 5. Let's test that real quick. Alright, there we go. It's actually working with 5, so scrap that. It actually works. The main reason that this works, and this is something important to keep in mind, is that the distance between the block sections is very similar. It doesn't have to be exactly equal, but by the time that this car reaches this block section, the car in front of it will already have cleared the block section in front of it. And that's basically why we can see that the car can pass over all of the block section brakes without having to wait on a single one of them, and that is what we're looking for. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with this layout as it stands right now, and that's basically it for this tutorial. A couple of notes are really in the end that you want to keep those block sections in mind if you want to realistically do this. Make sure that the spaces between the block sections are large enough and you've got enough block sections to actually run quite a few trains on these coasters. You could have some more twisty sections and some less helixes, but these are some of the basic elements and layout looks that these coasters have. And as for doing other things with these coasters, there are actually some very interesting stuff that you can do with these things. All these spinning coasters actually make for some pretty great indoor coasters, like for example Crush's coaster at Disneyland Paris or Laugh Track at Hershey Park, which are both also the standard SC2000 model, except with some very minor differences. But since these kinds of coasters are already very compact anyway, you don't really need to design a layout specifically for the indoor aspect, and you can usually just kind of build around it and add scenery around the ride to make it an indoor coaster. Especially in this case, I think, since all you really have to cover up is a big sort of triangle pyramid shaped trapezoid, there we go, thing around the main layout that we have going on here with just one part jutting out for the station. You don't actually even need that large of a building to even turn this layout into an indoor coaster. Even if the layout isn't built for it, and it could be a little bit more compact, these are some great coasters if you want to build an indoor coaster but you don't have too much space to do it with. Now that will be all for this tutorial on spinning coasters. I hope you learned something from it, and if you're still interested in these coasters in general, I definitely recommend checking out some of the links below, especially the Roller Coaster Tycoon database, which has all kinds of different coasters, basically also ordered based on the type of spinning coasters that they are. So there's lots of inspirational material in there, and for some reason, and this is in no way any advertising or anything, there are actually some pretty detailed brochures on these kinds of coasters as well. But anyway, you're probably just looking to build a pretty cool, neat little spinning coaster, and hopefully this will help you on your way on that mission as well. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.